Good evening. So we are continuing our online lectures, and we had gotten to the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. And I mentioned that he's the youngest person to ever become president. He enters the White House when he's 43. He gets there because of the assassination of William McKinley. And Teddy Roosevelt doesn't sleep much. He's a person who maybe sleeps 4 or 5 hours a day. You know, really, he is a person who burns the candle at both ends, tireless, and I think that's a factor why he burns out so quickly. And he dies in his early 60s, which for the wealthy is actually less than the average lifespan at that point. He is going to have a very different view of presidential power than his predecessors. Now, we had a handful of presidents between 1789 and Teddy Roosevelt in 1901 who made expansive use of their powers under the Constitution. I would say, obviously, George Washington. Everything Washington did, of course, was a president. An example for the following presidents. Thomas Jefferson, that's certainly true, even though he supposedly believed in limited federal power and states' rights. That was certainly true of Andrew Jackson and James K. Polk and Abraham Lincoln. All these presidents embraced power, but for most of the 19th century, there's a real philosophical argument here about what the relative powers of the Congress and the presidency are. And frankly, when I read the Constitution, it's typical to talk about balance of powers. But I actually think, from my reading of the Constitution, that the writers of that document intended the Congress, which they saw as the most representative body, as the most, that was supposed to be the most powerful of the three branches. There was supposed to be a balance. There were supposed to be checks on the power of any branch of government, but I really think they intended Congress to be the central focus of power in the federal government. If you look at how things function under the Constitution, legislation starts in the Congress. A president can suggest bills, but the Congress has to pass it. If the president objects to a bill, and he vetoes it, the Congress can override the veto. If you have a case, where taxes have to be raised, those bills, the tax bills, have to originate in the House of Representatives. Any appointment the president makes to the cabinet, federal judges, those have to be approved by the U.S. Senate. War is an exclusive power of the Congress. Only the Congress has the power to declare war, and I really have to emphasize that. You may not know this. The last time the United States actually declared war was 1942, when they declared war on allies of Adolf Hitler. It's been 78 years since Congress has declared war. Have we had a war since then? I would say so. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq in 1991, Iraq in 2003, Afghanistan 2001, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Interventions in countries all over the world. We have been almost constantly at war. What happened is, in the era of nuclear weapons and the confrontation with the Soviet Union after World War II, what came to be known as the Cold War, there was a sense of urgency, and the Congress began to leave it to the discretion of the president when we get involved militarily in other countries. Now, there are laws that have been passed during the Vietnam era, the War Powers Act, where a president has to go back for authorization after we get involved in a war, and we have to renew that. But that's been automatic, and the Congress has automatically renewed that. But the intention was that war was such a serious decision that the most representative body of the federal government would make the decision whether or not to go to war. Whether or not we practice that anymore, that was the intent of the founders. The Congress is the only body that can remove members of other branches of the federal government. The Congress can impeach judges. The Congress can impeach the president, the vice president, members of the cabinet. The Congress can also, by the way, forcibly remove members of the House or the Senate. It's exclusive to the Congress, this power. So basically, anything that happens legislatively under the Constitution begins and at some point ends in the Congress. So the Congress is the centerpiece, but many presidents have asserted, in fact, that the president has unique powers. And there's been a shift in the 20th century from Teddy Roosevelt on, a power from the Congress to the White House. Now, I will note that most presidents in the 19th century had the theory that I mentioned before, which is the Congress is the centerpiece. Most of them were content to, if they thought a bill was unconstitutional, to veto it, to simply enforce the laws passed by Congress. But most of them are completely forgettable. There are only really a handful of presidents you need to know very much about. That's not true after Teddy Roosevelt. He changes the nature of the office, and he changes the amount of attention the public pays to the president. And so there are a couple of theories he has regarding that office that are really significant. Number one, he describes the presidency as a bully pulpit. So I have to translate 1901 English to modern English. In that era, when we're talking about bully, the word bully, we're not talking about someone picking on someone else. That's an adjective that means basically terrific, great, on fleek, lit, etc., etc. That's what that means. It means it's fantastic if something is bully. Or if you say bully, that means, man, you think that's the coolest thing ever. How great. Of course, a pulpit is where a preacher stands in church and delivers a sermon. And so together, what he's saying is the White House is a fantastic platform from which the president can focus the nation's attention, from which the nation or the president can set priorities, and that's going to be how he uses that office. He believes that's up to the president for this reason. He believes that the president has a unique position, and this comes under the stewardship theory, that congressmen represent particular parts of states, congressional districts. Senators represent states, but the president and the vice president are the only two members of the federal government who are elected by the entire nation, whose fate politically is determined by the entire nation. And as such, they are the national leaders. And as national leaders, it's their responsibility to guide the agenda. Now, it's interesting, Roosevelt will not do one thing that Woodrow Wilson, who is another progressive president, does. Roosevelt will not deliver State of the Union addresses in person. The first two presidents, George Washington and John Adams, went to the Congress when they would make their required annual State of the Union address in person, deliver the speech. Thomas Jefferson was a brilliant writer, but he was also painfully shy about speaking in public. And so he sent written copies to the Congress of his State of the Union address. One of his allies in the Congress would read them. That example was followed by every president until Woodrow Wilson, who was a college professor. And you may note that college professors like to talk. So this is certainly true. Roosevelt, later on, when he saw Wilson do that, he said, basically, why didn't I think of that? But it doesn't matter, because Teddy Roosevelt does become the person who sets the tone for the priorities of the government and what the top legislation is going to be considered. Now, another aspect of how Theodore Roosevelt uses the powers of the presidency is in the use of executive orders. And this is a significant shift. Now, presidents have used executive orders since George Washington. What does that mean? Well, it's the job of the executive branch, which the president holds, to interpret laws passed by Congress and to enforce them. And to enforce them based on that president's view of that legislation and the views of the cabinet officers who had the different departments of the executive branch. So, there have been many famous executive orders, one of which was the Emancipation Proclamation. Presidents head not only the executive branch of the federal government, but because the military is under the executive branch, they head the military. They're the civilian head of the military. And so Abraham Lincoln issued an executive order interpreting his powers under the Constitution and under the powers granted him by the Congress in pursuing the Civil War, that he had the authority as a war measure to undermine the economy of the Confederate States of America, to order the liberation of slaves in states or parts of states still in rebellion as of January 1st, 1863. That was an executive order. The president reads the law as it stands, and he interprets it and uses his power based on his interpretation of that law. This is a power that's there. However, until Theodore Roosevelt, it wasn't used very often. So between the end of the Civil War in 1865, because Lincoln used that power a lot during the Civil War, it was an emergency. But between Abraham Lincoln's death in 1865 and the start of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency in 1901, after another presidential assassination, presidents issued 158 executive orders. In his 7 years in the White House, Roosevelt uses the executive orders, the power of an executive order, 1,006. The contrast in 36 years, 158, 7 years under Roosevelt, 1,006. And it is a little absurd sometimes the degree to which Roosevelt uses his executive orders. So for instance, he was frustrated by the needless complexity of American spelling of English. And he was trying to use his position as president to influence how Americans spelled words. The English language comes from lots of different foreign sources, so it creates unpredictable spelling in a lot of ways. So he directed the executive branch departments, like the Department of Justice, the Interior Department, et cetera, these different departments in government, the Defense Department, I meant to say, to change the spellings of certain words. And he came up with a style book, his suggested spelling. So the past tense of the word kissed, he wanted spelled K-I-S-T. Through, he wanted spelled T-H-R-U. Enough, he wanted spelled E-N-U-F. In other words, he's inventing texting. He spelled words the way people spell when they text each other. I don't think he created LOL or any of those spellings, but anyway. That was too much for the House of Representatives. They thought, man, Roosevelt has really got an exaggerated sense of his power and influence. So the House of Representatives votes 142 to 24 to rescind that particular order. Roosevelt realizes, okay, maybe I went too far this time. He rescinds the order before the matter reaches the Senate. There really is no matter of American life that Roosevelt doesn't feel like his leadership could have a positive influence. And I want to get back to the progressive attitude towards government. It had been often that in the 19th century, conservatives, but other people agreed that government was basically a necessary evil, that people without control will do certain bad things, so you need a government to prevent them from doing those bad things. But the problem with government is that people in government tend to abuse their power. So the best government is, as one of the transcendentalist writers wrote, not Jefferson, the best government is the one that governs least. The smallest government, the one with that exercises the least authority, is the best government. That was the conservative view. The progressive saying society is getting too complicated for that. And we need a strong government to act basically as law enforcement, just like you have a traffic cop directing traffic, you need the government to regulate things like wages, workplace safety, etc. Well, Roosevelt fully embraces this idea and from his office of presidency. And then, once again, it reaches unpredictable areas of American life. So we have Teddy Roosevelt here. Let me call up the pictures, wake up my computer again. One sport was beginning to become very popular. So there's Teddy Roosevelt. And in his era, one sport was becoming increasingly popular. The most popular sport in America at that time was baseball, particularly professional baseball. But football, American football, was becoming increasingly popular at the college level. Pro football began to exist in the first two decades of the 20th century, but hardly anyone watched it. Pro football was ignored largely until after World War II. In the 1950s, it became popular largely with the spread of television. Television's invented in the late 1930s. It becomes a common household item in the 1950s. That's when people began to watch the games, and there's some really historic games in that era that create a massive audience. And by the 1970s, professional football is more popular than baseball. But baseball was a big sport, but people did love their college football. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt played it when he went to Harvard University, and so did his son. But here's the problem. If you look at this picture, I think you'll note something. They're not wearing helmets, are they? And basically, they're wearing a shirt, pants. The padding is almost non-existent. Football was, in that era, a deadly game. Brutal and even deadly. The game at that point, it evolved from a kind of odd combination of what Americans call soccer, the rest of the world calls football, and rugby. And a lot of those origins were still present. It was illegal in the game to throw the football, to pass it. Every game was a running play. Every game involved direct, linemen smacking each other, offensive and defensive line, running backs carrying the ball and smacking into the defenders. And it was common for players at that point to pile on top of each other, even after the ball carrier had been stopped. The play didn't stop automatically, so people would pile up. And in those pile-ups, they'd punch each other in the face. They'd gouge each other's eyes. There was fighting going on during that point. Noses would get broken. Jaws would get broken. And the players wore this flimsy equipment. And I said it was typical not to wear a helmet. When they had helmets, they were utterly flimsy to the point of being useless. So here's a typical, this is from the 1930s. That's a football helmet, believe it or not. Note there's no face guard. No protection for the face at all. It's made of leather. It is not going to protect you from head injuries. And we know now about what injuries to the head do to football players with all the modern equipment today. Football literally causes brain damage, something called CTE. Well, then it was really common. So between 1900 and 1905, 45 college football players died from head injuries, broken necks, shattered spinal columns, and other game-related traumas. And the worst year, in 1905, there were 18 players die in one season, 150 seriously injured. When that happens, several colleges like Northwestern in Illinois and Columbia actually suspend their football programs. They say this is becoming too catastrophic. And Roosevelt is going to do something with his power as president. He's going to summon to the White House coaches from Harvard, Yale, other Ivy League schools, because at that point, the biggest football powerhouses were in the Ivy League. They're not even a factor in college football anymore. They still play, but they're not major powers. They were then. And he's going to say, look, you have an option. Either we're going to make the game safer, or I'm going to suggest legislation before the Congress that football be made illegal. So they get together, they meet, they discuss how the rules could be changed. And so a couple of things really important in that era. Number one, they call for the play to stop when the ball carrier's knees touch the ground. You don't have the pileups where a lot of the injuries were taking place and where a lot of the violence of the game took place. The game stops every time a ball carrier's knees touch the ground. No one can pile on anymore. It becomes a penalty. Second, they legalize the forward pass, which actually makes the game less dangerous for all the players at that field at the time. The ball receiver, the pass receiver, is in danger when he leaps up to catch the ball, but the other players are in less peril with passing. And that actually substantially reduces the number of fatal injuries. They become a rarity, and especially as equipment improves throughout the 20s, particularly after World War II, is when you begin to see really much more sophisticated equipment, although we realize now that the human body probably is not evolved to play that game. The head is actually vulnerable when it is hit, and there is lasting damage, and it is extraordinary the percentage. Almost all the athletes they have performed autopsies on after their playing careers, people who play college or football levels, pro football level, have had this condition called CTE. And by the way, that leads to depression and it leads to violence. A lot of people spoke about O.J. Simpson, who I know you're familiar with, who was one of the most amazing running backs in NFL history. But they always talk about during his career how they had to custom make helmets to fit on his enormous head, that it was bigger than the average football players. And that's a symptom of CTE, which is the neurological damage that occurs from that. And one of the things that people with CTE, a tendency they show is towards violence. And I would not be surprised that when O.J. Simpson dies, if he has an autopsy performed, that we'll find out that may have been a factor in his behavior leading up to the death of his wife. Now, generally speaking, Roosevelt concerns himself with matters that are a lot weightier than spelling and football. And in fact, when he becomes president in 1901, he writes a letter to a friend, and he says that the absolute most vital question facing the country is the power of what are called trusts. We talked about this before when we were talking about Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller. We were talking about some of the big businessmen in the late 19th century, the robber barons, if you recall that conversation. And a trust is a type of business monopoly, and it's organized in a way to prevent people from knowing exactly who controls what. And as I said, in a trust, you have the board of directors of a company, like Standard Oil, go out and buy majority shares of stock in their supposed competitors and their suppliers. They take those shares of stock, they buy them individually, but they put them in a trust where it's managed in the interest of the company, like Standard Oil. So Standard Oil is a monopoly, but the monopoly is hidden. And this had been a form of business that had taken over almost the entire economy. And the power, the economic power, ended up in the hands of very few people, and trusts produce basically overpriced goods and services. They charge too much. They underpay their workers, and if you're a worker trained in a particular industry, if a trust controls it, there's no place else to go for work. They provide lousy service for customers. And so there's a lot of hostility to trust, and by the way, a law had been passed in 1890. John Sherman was a senator from Ohio. He was the brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, who we talked about during the Civil War, who issued Special Order number 15 that offered to freedmen 40 acres and a mule if they applied And so this family is really illustrious. This particular act made trust price-fixing conspiracies where businesses conspire to charge the same high price for the same services and goods, any kind of monopoly or conspiracy to crush competition. It made all those things illegal. But here's the problem. It was passed in 1890. Between 1890 and 1901, it basically sat there, that law, gathering dust. Presidents were very pro-business. That hasn't changed. And when the Sherman Act was used, it was used entirely in a way it was not intended. Courts would use the Sherman Act against labor unions. They would say that when labor unions went on strike, that those labor unions were a monopoly, a trust of workers. And by going on strike, they were restraining trade, and judges would order workers to go back to work, which of course undermined any fight they had for higher wages, better benefits. So, Roosevelt thinks that trusts are not inherently bad, but certain trusts are bad. He draws a distinction between good trusts that he thinks provide quality products efficiently, and the bad trusts that are only interested in greed and are hurting consumers, workers, and preventing innovation. And so he wants to flex his power on a serious issue. And so he decides to challenge some of the most prominent trusts. And one of the first acts as president, Roosevelt takes, and this is very popular, he begins an antitrust action against the Northern Securities Company using the Sherman Act. Who created Northern Securities? One of the most famous Wall Street investors of all time, J.P. Morgan. There's still an investment firm named after him. And here's how Northern Securities came into existence. There were three major railroad companies in the Northwest that were competing against each other to the point that drove almost all the three of them drove each other to the point of bankruptcy. J.P. Morgan swooped in, bought all three companies, consolidated them into one company, and monopolized through that railroad traffic between Chicago and the Pacific Coast. So a lot of people are going to be upset about this. Farmers are going to be grotesquely overcharged by this new railroad monopoly. And we talked about how that's a common thing that farmers experience, and it inspired the radicalism of the populist movement. Small investors who had invested in the original railroad companies lose money in the deal. They end up selling, their shares are bought when the shares are at rock bottom, and then the shares go up in value greatly when the monopoly is created. And the general public is, in fact, not happy with so much economic power resting in so few hands. And they're not happy with the lousy services provided by Northern Securities to people who use the railroads. So he investigates. What is Roosevelt's motivation? This. He's worried that trusts are going to provoke radicalism. He is aware that McKinley, his predecessor in office, had been assassinated by an anarchist. He's worried about elections where socialists are winning. And that's the thing about the progressives. They're reformers. They're not revolutionaries. They don't want revolution. As I've said before, the progressives want to save capitalism from the capitalist. And so he acts, and something surprising happens. Judges had been very friendly to people like J.P. Morgan. But judges react to political trends. They want to be seen as credible. And they're worried about the type of judges Roosevelt might appoint if he loses the case. And so what happens? They order Northern Securities dissolved into competing companies. This is a new thing. And the judges are responding to Roosevelt's push. And he's immensely popular for doing this. And he acts against 43 major trusts during the course of his presidency. And these are big ones. A trust that dominates cigarette manufacturing, cigar manufacturing, etc. The American Tobacco Company. By the way, they always knew cigarettes were bad. In fact, people in the 1800s called cigarettes coffin nails. They knew this. But anyway, people are smoking incredible amounts of cigarettes at that point. They act against the DuPont chemical firm, owned by one of the richest families then and now. And here's the biggest one of all. They file action against Standard Oil, owned by the richest American of all time, one of the richest human beings to ever walk planet Earth, a man who had a fortune approximately $360 billion adjusted for inflation, more than a third of a trillion when he died, John D. Rockefeller. They act against him, and Standard Oil is ordered by a federal court to dissolve into 7 competing companies. A couple of those companies since have merged again, Exxon and Mobil, but nevertheless, Rockefeller loses control of 6/7 of the empire he created. Roosevelt beats John D. Rockefeller. And so regardless of his conservative motives for radical action, he's immensely popular. And because of this action, people hate these trusts. And then that extends with his actions regarding a coal strike in 1902. Again, this illustrates the consolidation of economic power in few hands. In May 1902, more than 100,000 coal miners in Pennsylvania go on strike, demanding higher wages, shorter work hours, in recognition of a union they have formed called the United Mine Workers. When a union is recognized, that means a company has agreed that they will negotiate contracts with that union, that the union represents the workers in that industry or at that work site. That's a major gain in power and leverage when a union gets recognized, and that's what these striking miners want. Their union is not recognized at this point. Now, this action is going to threaten a nationwide coal shortage. And coal is as important to the country at that point as oil is today. Whenever there's a natural disaster and oil doubles or triples in price instantly, which I'm always suspicious of, you feel it. Twice in my lifetime, there have been oil boycotts. 1973, Arab nations who had fought a war with Israel, and the United States supported Israel, instituted an oil boycott. They stopped selling oil to the United States, and there were long lines that took hours. There's a revolution in Iran in 1979. They overthrow a dictator, the Shah of Iran, a monarch, and a theological government, government based on religion takes over. They resent the United States because of its support for the Shah. They boycott oil. And I remember these oil boycotts, people got in fights. One of the oil boycotts, a pregnant woman got punched in the face. They had to institute controls like you could buy oil only every other day. They looked at your, the 73, they looked at the license plate number. If your license plate ended in an odd number or even number, you bought it on different days, bought gasoline. You buy gasoline at that point. So this coal industry is as important to the economy in that era as what gasoline is today. So I was saying oil, I meant gasoline. But anyway, 1902, the strike starts, and here's the key. This really illustrates the power of whole industries in very few hands. 6 Eastern Railroad companies own 70% of the coal mines in the country. So the mine owners have the power of the railroad companies that own the mines or invested in the mine industry. They have that power behind them, that consolidation power. They refuse to negotiate. They won't talk to the union leaders at all. And Roosevelt's furious because he's afraid that this will spark revolution. And he's also worried about the economy collapsing with a coal shortage. So he sees this as a national defense issue. he realizes he has power as president to issue executive orders. So he makes a threat. First of all, he calls the mine owners wooden-headed, obstinate, and stupid. I sometimes wish presidents would do that, maybe not this one, towards certain business owners. He says that the mine owners are unable to see the black storm impending, meaning the economic damage and also the possibility of revolution. So he's going to demand something. He's going to say, he's going to create an arbitration commission that will listen to the mine owners and the mine workers. And if they don't agree to the findings of the arbitration commission, he's going to order the federal government to seize control of the mines. Those will become a federal government asset. We'll take them over. We'll take them from the mine owners, their property, and we'll run it, and we'll have federal troops work in the mines. Well, the mine owners are frightened about this, and they've seen Roosevelt in action. They take him seriously, so they blink. They agree to the arbitration proposal. So here's what happens. The miners return to work. The arbitration commission rules that miners deserve a reduction in work hours. They deserve a wage increase, but here is where this is a win-win for Roosevelt. Roosevelt doesn't like unions. He doesn't like the banding of the working class together against the wealthy. He's a wealthy man. The arbitration commission does not rule that the mine owners have to recognize the United Mine Workers. So they get higher wages, reduced working hours, they get many of their upfront demands. The union itself is not recognized. For Roosevelt, that's perfect. So it's interpreted, however, by the average voter as a victory for the working class. And to be clear, previously when there were strikes like this, like in 1886 when there was a strike of railroad workers that paralyzed much of the railroad traffic in the United States, Grover Cleveland ordered the National Guard in to take control of the railroads. The National Guard was frequently used by presidents to destroy strikes. And federal power was used against the working class. This time there's arbitration. So his action in the Northern Securities case and the other trust cases and the strikes gives him a giant following. And in 1904, Teddy Roosevelt realized that he really loves being president, and he wants to win a term in his own right, not simply filling out William McKinley's term that ended with assassination. He runs for another term in office in 1904, and he promises voters a square deal. What does that mean? Well, again, in 1901 talk, a square deal basically is an even-handed deal. A deal that's fair to everybody. A deal that considers all sides and the needs of every group. And he gets the backing of the working class in most of the country, the backing of middle-class voters who don't like the power of big corporations. He gets support from industrial workers, farmers in states like Nebraska, Kansas, and so on like him. The only state he doesn't prevail is in the South, which always votes for Democrats in that era, during the era of segregation. He ends up winning 57.9% of the popular vote, almost 58%, against a Democratic nominee, a basically unknown New York State judge named Alton B. Parker. That's one of the times William Jennings Bryan didn't run for president, get a nomination, and lose. That was, he did that 3 times. So he has a giant mandate for reform. This is where he's going to run into a problem. At that point, I've said before, these parties changed dramatically. And in that era, there are progressives in the Democratic Party, but they're not the majority at that point. And there are progressives in the Republican Party. But the Republican Party since Lincoln has tended to be dominated by really conservative figures. Roosevelt's kind of an exception. And he's the most progressive president the Republicans had since Lincoln. And in his one term, full term in his own right, conservative Republicans are going to be his biggest obstacle. Much of the program Roosevelt wants to pass is going to meet opposition from members of his own party. However, there are going to be two major important pieces of legislation passed in this era that really represent this expansion of government power under the progressives that are going to really, I think, improve people's lives. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. Both of these are going to be passed in 1905. We'll talk about the origin of those bills, the role a journalist played in getting them passed, and Roosevelt's position on the environment next time.